They called it the Iron Cathedral, a name whispered with contempt. The British, they had another name. The three-story disaster. The Soviets, they called it a coffin for 7 brothers. And the Germans, they laughed. They called it a splendid target, 1941. The M3 medium tank, the most mocked, the most ridiculed armored vehicle in the entire world. 10 feet tall, a gun jutting out from the hull like some forgotten warship from 1918. It looked like it belonged to the past, to a war already lost. Every army that received one found new ways to insult it. But in May 1942, this joke, this monument to failure, did something impossible. Something no British tank could do. It stopped Rommel's panzers. Cold. June 1940, German armor conquered France. 6 weeks. That's all it took. The panzer divisions that shattered the French army weren't superior in numbers. No. The French actually had more tanks. But German crews, better trained. German tactics, revolutionary. And German commanders, they understood something the French didn't. How to concentrate armor at the decisive moment, at the killing point. American military planners watched the newsreels. They understood what they were seeing, a new kind of warfare. Tanks weren't support weapons anymore. Tanks were the weapon, the decisive arm. The United States Army possessed roughly 400 tanks. Most were M2 light tanks, armed with machine guns. A few newer models carried small 37mm cannons. If America entered this war, its soldiers would face the most experienced, the most deadly armored force in history, with equipment designed for a war that no longer existed. The Army knew exactly what it needed: a medium tank, carrying a 75mm gun, not because of the caliber, because of what that ammunition could do. The weapon could fire armor-piercing rounds to kill enemy tanks, obvious, but it could also fire high-explosive rounds to destroy fortifications, machine gun nests, infantry positions. Smaller guns couldn't do both. The British 2-pounder was 40mm. It lacked an effective high-explosive round. When British tanks encountered infantry, fortified positions, they had nothing but machine guns. The 75mm was different, a dual-purpose weapon. One tank could kill enemy armor and support infantry. That flexibility would prove decisive. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. American factories couldn't build a proper 75mm tank. It's not yet. Tank turrets require precision engineering. The gun sits inside a rotating ring mounted on the hull. When the gun fires, recoil forces slam backward, through the turret ring, into the hull structure. Bigger guns mean bigger recoil. Bigger recoil requires bigger turret rings. A 75mm gun needed a turret ring over 60 inches in diameter to handle the forces involved. American foundries in 1940 couldn't cast rings that large. The precision machining didn't exist. Building new foundries, training workers, 18 months, minimum. The M4 Sherman was already on the drawing board. Proper turret, proper gun, proper tank. But the Sherman wouldn't reach the battlefield in numbers until late 1942. The Army needed armor in 1941. Something that could fight panzers now, not in 2 years. Engineers at Rock Island Arsenal proposed a solution that made everyone uncomfortable. What if they mounted the 75mm gun in the hull? Instead of a turret, it was an obsolete concept. World War I tanks had used sponson-mounted guns. Naval vessels still used them. But modern tank doctrine demanded rotating turrets for flexibility. A sponson gun could only fire in a limited arc. To engage targets on the flank, the entire tank had to turn. In a fast-moving battle, that delay could be fatal. The engineers knew all of this. They proposed the design anyway. Because a 75mm gun in a sponson was infinitely better than nothing at all. The Army approved development, July 1940, the first prototype, ready by January 1941, production began in August. The M3 medium tank stood 10 feet tall. For comparison, the Sherman would stand 9 feet. A modern M1 Abrams, 8 feet. The M3 towered over everything, a monument, a target. The height came from stacking components. An aircraft engine sat in the rear. At the right, Continental R975, a radial engine originally designed for airplanes, powerful, reliable, but tall. The 75mm sponson sat in the front right hull. Above it, a small turret carrying a 37mm gun for engaging lighter targets. A commander's cupola sat on top of that. 3 levels, 10 feet, the 3-story disaster. 7 crewmen squeezed inside, 7 men, in a metal coffin. The armor was riveted steel, 51mm thick at the front, to the crew inside. Those rivets were essentially bullets waiting to happen. A non-penetrating hit on the outside could shear a rivet head off on the inside, turning it into shrapnel. Bouncing around a crowded steel box, combined with the suicidal height. These flaws meant American tankers didn't just mock the M3, they feared it. Nobody wanted to fight in this thing. But between August 1941 and December 1942, American factories would build 6,258 of them in North Africa. The British 8th Army had been losing for 18 months. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in February 1941 with a small German force to support the Italians. Within weeks, he had pushed the British back to the Egyptian border. Within months, he had become the most feared commander in the desert. The British launched Operation Crusader in November 1941. Over 700 tanks attacked Rommel's positions. The result? A tactical mess. British armor charged German anti-tank guns. German panzers picked off British tanks at range. The British recaptured ground, but the cost was staggering. They lost over 500 tanks, but Rommel lost over 300, more than half of his entire armored force. The problem was firepower. British Crusader and Stuart tanks carried 2-pounder guns, 40mm weapons with one critical flaw. They could only fire armor-piercing rounds. The 2-pounder was a pop gun at combat ranges. It struggled to penetrate German Panzer III frontal armor. The newer Panzer III Specials, Panzer IVS, nearly immune. British tank crews would hit German tanks and watch their shells bounce off. Then German 50mm guns would punch through British armor like paper. The engagement math was brutal. Germans could kill British tanks at 800 meters. British could barely hurt Germans at 400 meters. Worse, without effective high-explosive rounds, they were helpless against soft targets. German 88mm crews learned they could stand their ground, in the open, for the crews. It was a recurring nightmare. They had to close to suicidal ranges just to scratch the paint on a panzer, while knowing the Germans could punch through their armor before the British could even aim. It wasn't just a tactical problem. It was a crisis of confidence. They knew their tools were broken. By early 1942, the British needed a miracle. January 1942. The first M3 Grants arrived in Egypt. The British had modified the design slightly. Their version had a lower turret with the radio inside. They named it after Ulysses Grant. The standard American version kept the taller turret. The British called it the Lee, after Grant's opponent. British tank crews gathered around the towering machines and stared. The height was absurd. On the flat desert, this thing would be visible from miles away. But then, they examined the gun. 75mm, almost twice the caliber of their 2-pounders. It could fire armor-piercing rounds to kill tanks, and high-explosive to kill everything else. They had been dying with pop guns for 18 months. Then, they test-fired the 75mm. The round flew further, hit harder, than anything British tankers had ever used. At 1,000 meters, the shell punched through armor plate representing a Panzer III. At 1,500 meters, it still made lethal hits. The high explosive rounds were even more impressive. They could destroy gun positions, fortifications, infantry concentrations, from ranges where enemy weapons couldn't reach the tank. After 18 months of impotence, they suddenly possessed a weapon that could kill anything on the battlefield. The Grant was ugly. The Grant was tall. The Grant was tactically awkward. But the Grant could kill panzers from 1,000 meters away. British commanders assigned 167 Grants to the 4th Armored Brigade. They positioned them for Rommel's expected offensive, and then they waited. By May 1942, both armies had fortified positions along the Gazala line in Libya. Rommel commanded 560 tanks. The British had 850, including 167 of the new Grants. With the 4th Armored Brigade, German intelligence reported the arrival of tall, awkward American vehicles with hull-mounted guns. Rommel's staff dismissed the threat. The height made these tanks obvious targets. The Sponson gun was a World War I concept. German crews would pick them off easily. May 26, 1942. Rommel launched Operation Venezia. Afrika Korps swept south around the Gazala line. Exactly as planned. German tank commanders expected another victory. Another British retreat. Another demonstration of German superiority. The next morning, they ran into the 4th Armored Brigade. May 27, 1942. The desert south of Gazala. Panzers from the 5th 10th Panzer Division spotted British armor and moved to engage. Standard tactics. Close to 500 meters where German guns could penetrate British armor reliably. The distance was 1,200 meters. When the British opened fire, German commanders didn't understand what was happening. Shells were hitting from ranges where British guns had always been useless. The shells weren't bouncing off. The first Panzer exploded. Fire and smoke erupted from the turret. Then a second. Then a third. German crews pushed forward, trying to close the gap. Their 50mm guns couldn't penetrate the strange new tanks at this range. They needed to get closer. The British kept firing. The math was simple and brutal. The M3 Grant's 75mm gun could penetrate Panzer III frontal armor from 1,000 meters. The short-barreled 50mm guns on most German tanks couldn't penetrate Grant armor until point-blank range. That meant the Grants had a killing zone, measured in hundreds of meters, a stretch of desert, where they could destroy panzers that couldn't shoot back. German commanders tried to rush through the killing zone. They accelerated toward the British line, hoping speed would save them. It didn't. British gunners had time for multiple shots before German tanks closed to effective range. Each shot that hit meant another panzer burning. The discipline of the Afrika Korps began to crack. Radio chatter, usually precise and professional, dissolved into confusion. Veteran crews who had laughed at the splendid target were now screaming about invisible batteries destroying them from the horizon. They couldn't understand what was killing them. Reports flooded back to German headquarters throughout the morning. British tanks engaging from over 1,000 meters. German shells not penetrating at range. Multiple panzers lost in each engagement. The attack on the British center had stalled completely. Units that should have broken through were pinned down, taking losses. Rommel received the reports and immediately understood what had changed. The Americans had given the British a tank with a gun that outranged everything in his army. 18 months of equipment superiority had vanished overnight. The Afrika Korps wasn't facing the same enemy anymore. Rommel later wrote about Gazala. The advent of the new American tank, he admitted, tore great holes in our ranks. He added a painful truth: until May 1942, German tanks had in general been superior in quality to the corresponding British types. This was now no longer true, at least not to the same extent. That phrase, "at least not to the same extent," captured the shock. For 18 months, German armor had dominated through superior equipment, superior training, superior tactics. In a single day, American industrial production had erased the equipment advantage. The 75mm gun changed everything. The ugly, mocked, compromised M3 Grant had given British crews the ability to kill panzers from ranges where they couldn't be killed back. Rommel understood this was just the beginning. Rommel adapted quickly. He had no choice. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun became his solution. Originally designed to shoot down planes, the 88 could also kill tanks at extreme range. It could destroy Grants from 2,000 meters, far beyond the 75mm effective range. Rommel pushed 88mm guns forward with his armored spearheads. Whenever his panzers encountered Grants, the 88s would engage first, from long range. He also desperately requested more Panzer IV specials. With the high-velocity 75mm gun, the upgraded weapon could match the Grant's range, but the new tanks wouldn't arrive in numbers for months. The Grant's height remained a fatal flaw. On the flat desert, German observers could spot them from miles away. Every engagement began with the Germans knowing exactly where the British armor was positioned. Rommel won the Battle of Gazala through tactical genius, not equipment superiority. He outmaneuvered the British. He exploited their mistakes. Tobruk fell in June. The British retreated deep into Egypt, but the cost was far higher than expected. Rommel captured Tobruk. He was promoted to Field Marshal, but his tank losses were unsustainable. German factories produced roughly 300 tanks per month. American factories were already building over 2,000. Every panzer destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Grant destroyed would be replaced within weeks. Rommel had won the battle. He was losing the war of production. At El Alamein in July, the British finally stopped him. The Grants weren't enough to win offensive battles, but they were enough to hold defensive positions, where German armor had to come to them. The Afrika Korps bled against the Grant line. Each attack cost tanks Rommel couldn't replace. The ugly American compromise was doing exactly what it was designed to do. In October 1942, the first M4 Shermans arrived in Egypt. Proper turret, rotating 75mm gun, lower profile, everything the M3 should have been. Montgomery assembled overwhelming force for the Second Battle of El Alamein. Over 1,000 tanks, Grants, Shermans, Crusaders, over 1,000 artillery pieces. The attack began on October 23rd. 12 days later, Rommel was in full retreat. The Afrika Korps would never recover. The Grant's 6-month war was over. It had held the line from Gazala to El Alamein. It had bled the Afrika Korps of irreplaceable tanks and crews. The coffin for 7 brothers, the Iron Cathedral, the splendid target. It had done its job. Today, surviving M3s sit in museums. Visitors walk past them toward the Shermans and Tigers. They glance at the awkward 10-foot silhouette and wonder, why anyone built something so ugly? The answer is simple. Because ugly was available when perfect wasn't. American engineers knew every flaw before the first M3 left the factory. The height, the sponson gun, the riveted armor. They built it anyway, because the alternative was nothing. The M3 wasn't designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to exist, when the best tank wasn't possible yet. Rommel understood what that meant. The Americans, he noted, had designed, built, and deployed an effective medium tank in under a year. Germany had nothing comparable to that industrial capability. The Iron Cathedral wasn't beautiful. It wasn't perfect. But when it mattered most, when British tank crews were dying with weapons that couldn't fight back, it was there. And that made all the difference.